It was just after midnight at the eerily quiet Lansing International Airport. Most flights had already departed, leaving only a few weary travelers scattered across the dimly lit terminal. I was among them, drained from a long day of travel but unable to ignore a growing sense of unease. The silence didn't feel ordinary for an empty airport. It was dense and oppressive, almost suffocating. I had settled into an uncomfortable seat, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. The hours stretched endlessly, and the idea of finally reaching my hotel, showering and collapsing into bed felt like a distant dream. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, something shifted. The stillness became oppressive, like the building itself was watching, waiting. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the terminal. It hit me so sharply that I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. The automatic doors were shut, and no windows were open. There was no logical reason for the chill. I glanced around, but the few passengers nearby seemed oblivious, lost in sleep or their own worlds. Then the lights flickered just once, then again, staying off longer the second time. The flickering didn't faze anyone else. I looked around for staff or maintenance workers, but the terminal seemed deserted. The absence of human activity amplified the unease gnawing at me. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that my mind was playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. At around 2 a.m., I noticed a figure at the far end of the terminal. It looked like a man in a dark suit, standing perfectly still near one of the gates. At first, I assumed he was another stranded traveler, perhaps pacing while waiting for a delayed flight. But as I squinted, I noticed something odd. His posture was hunched, and his arms hung unnaturally low, as if they didn't quite fit his body. Curiosity and dread battled within me. Against my better judgment, I stood and took a few cautious steps toward him. The closer I got, the stranger he seemed. His head was tilted slightly downward, obscuring his face. The air around him felt colder, heavier. When I was close enough to call out, the lights flickered again, this time more violently. For a brief moment, his face or the absence of it came into view. There was no face at all, just a void, a shadowy emptiness that absorbed the light around it. My breath caught, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. When the lights returned, the figure was gone. The space where he had been was empty, as if he'd never existed. I rushed back to my seat, heart pounding, glancing over my shoulder. My rational mind tried to explain it a trick of the light, my exhaustion playing games, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I sank into the seat, gripping my phone like a lifeline. As I scrolled aimlessly, a notification appeared. It was a message from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. The text read, "Don't stay there too long." A chill ran down my spine. How could they know where I was? I typed a reply, asking what they meant. But before I could send it, the lights flickered again, plunging the terminal into near total darkness. When the lights returned, the terminal felt wrong. The walls seemed farther away, as though the space had stretched. The rows of seats were empty, and a thick, oppressive silence hung in the air. Then, from the far end of the terminal, I heard it, a loud thud. I froze, heart racing, and scanned the area. Near one of the gates stood a small figure, a child in a tattered nightgown. Her back was to me, and she didn't move. The sight was so out of place that I felt paralyzed. What was a child doing here at this hour, alone and in such strange clothing? The urge to approach her battled with the instinct to flee. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath in the air. As I moved closer, faint whispers began to echo around me, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incoherent murmur. My feet felt like lead, but I kept moving, drawn toward the child. Her head tilted slightly, as though she sensed me. When I was just a few steps away, the lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness. In that brief moment, she turned to face me. Her face was pale and lifeless, her eyes empty voids that seemed to pull me in. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just the rising cacophony of whispers that surrounded us. The whispers filled my head, pressing against my skull like they were trying to break in. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then I felt a presence far more sinister than the child. It loomed around me, unseen but unmistakably there. The air grew so heavy that it felt like it would crush me. The whispers built to a deafening crescendo, and just when I thought I would collapse, the lights returned. The child was gone. The whispers ceased, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered, as though the darkness itself was watching me, waiting for its chance to return. I staggered back to my seat, trembling and drenched in sweat. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down I knew better. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the first ticket counter I could find, booking the next available flight out of Lansing. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've told no one, not even the friend who sent that cryptic message. But every time I set foot in an airport, I feel it a cold, unshakable dread. I know something followed me from that terminal, something old and angry, lurking in the shadows. It's waiting for me to drop my guard, to find myself alone again in its territory. Jake, a seasoned traveler, was well acquainted with long layovers and delayed flights. He had endured countless crowded terminals, stiff chairs, and overpriced coffee. But his layover at Granite Point Airport, a small regional hub tucked deep within a snowy mountain range, was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. It started with a missed connection. His flight from Chicago had been delayed, and by the time he arrived at Granite Point, the last flight to his destination had already taken off. The airport staff, apologetic but weary, handed him a voucher for an overnight stay in the terminal. The airport seemed deserted, eerily quiet for what should have been a bustling holiday season. Most of the shops and restaurants were shuttered, their gates pulled down, as though the place had been abandoned years ago. A lone janitor mopped the floor near Gate C, his movements slow and methodical. Jake settled into a chair near a darkened window, the view obscured by swirling snow. As midnight approached, Jake began to notice strange things. At first, it was the flicker of the overhead lights, a rhythmic stuttering that cast unsettling shadows across the terminal. Then came the whispers, faint but distinct, like a conversation taking place just out of earshot. He looked around, expecting to see other stranded passengers, but the seats around him were empty. Curiosity and unease gnawed at him. He decided to explore the terminal, hoping to find a vending machine or someone to talk to. The whispers grew louder as he moved, though he could never pinpoint their source. They seemed to echo from the walls, the ceiling, even the polished floor beneath his feet. Near Gate F, Jake found an old payphone, its receiver hanging loosely by the cord. The whispers were louder here, almost coherent. He hesitated before picking up the receiver. The static on the line was deafening, but beneath it he could swear he heard a voice calling his name. Startled, he dropped the receiver and backed away, colliding with a figure that had silently appeared behind him. It was the janitor, his face pale and gaunt under the flickering fluorescent lights. "You shouldn't be here," the janitor said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake tried to explain his situation, but the janitor shook his head. "This terminal, it's not meant for the living." Without another word, the man turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows. Jake's unease turned to dread. He hurried back to his seat, only to find his belongings scattered across the floor. His phone was missing, and his boarding pass was torn in half. The whispers had returned, louder and angrier now, filling the terminal with an oppressive noise. Desperation drove him to the airport's information desk. The lights above it flickered wildly as he approached. The computer screen glowed faintly, displaying a list of flights, all of them marked canceled. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the terminal. Jake spun around to see the janitor again, standing by a maintenance door. He gestured for Jake to follow. With no other options, Jake obeyed, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space. The janitor led him down a narrow hallway lined with old, peeling posters advertising flights that hadn't existed in decades. At the end of the hallway was a locked door. The janitor pulled out a ring of keys, muttering something under his breath. As the door creaked open, a gust of icy air blew past Jake, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. The room beyond was a storage area, filled with rows of old luggage, each suitcase tagged with a name and a date. Jake approached one, recognizing his own name written on a faded tag. The date matched his current flight itinerary. "What is this?" he demanded, turning to the janitor. "This is where they keep the lost ones," the janitor replied cryptically. Before Jake could press further, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The luggage began to rattle and shake, the tags fluttering as though caught in an invisible wind. Shadows slithered across the walls, converging on Jake with malicious intent. Panicking, Jake turned and bolted back toward the terminal. The hallway seemed endless, stretching impossibly far with each step he took. The janitor's voice echoed behind him, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't leave," the voice said. "You're already part of the terminal." When Jake finally burst back into the main terminal, the space was unrecognizable. The walls were cracked and covered in moss, the ceiling sagging with the weight of years of neglect. The seats were broken, their upholstery torn and stained. The airport was no longer the modern hub he had walked into hours ago. It was a decayed relic of a bygone era. Jake's screams went unanswered as the shadows closed in around him. The last thing he saw was the janitor, standing motionless in the center of the terminal, his hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. When the airport reopened the next morning, Jake was nowhere to be found. His luggage remained untouched by Gate C, but there was no trace of the man who had sat waiting for his flight. Granite Point Airport continued its operations as usual, though the staff whispered about the strange occurrences that plagued the terminal at night. And somewhere, deep within the bowels of the airport, Jake's suitcase sat among the others, a silent testament to the passengers who never made it to their destinations.